Buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti. Io sono Junko Terao della redazione di Internazionale, editor asiatica, e vi devo dare innanzitutto un'informazione di servizio. Stasera, fuori programma, stasera qui in questo teatro, alle 21 ci sarà un incontro dedicato al futuro dell'informazione con il columnist del New York Times David Carr, che forse qualcuno di voi ha già avuto modo di vedere ieri, e il direttore del Guardian Alan Rusbridger. Quindi alle 21 si parlerà di futuro dell'informazione, l'incontro è fermate le rotative. Il futuro dell'India invece è il tema dell'incontro di oggi. L'India, la nuova India, un paese che è reduce da 20 anni di boom economico, e luce e ombre dello sviluppo indiano è il sottotitolo che abbiamo scelto per questo incontro, perché vedremo come il paese è cambiato in questi 20 anni di forte crescita, seconda solo alla Cina. L'India, la crescita del PIL indiano ha raggiunto livelli appunto inediti, quasi raggiungendo quello della crescita cinese, e vedremo come il paese è cambiato, per chi è cambiato, perché come i nostri ospiti che adesso vi presenterò, non tutti hanno goduto di questo rapido sviluppo. Ne parleremo appunto con gli ospiti autorevoli che abbiamo invitato, a cui do il benvenuto e che vi presento subito. Alla mia destra, all'estrema destra, il professor Gyan Prakash, che è uno storico. Uno storico dell'Università di Princeton, è specializzato in storia dell'India moderna, in particolare di problemi legati alla modernità urbana. Ha appena pubblicato in Italia un libro su Bombay, su Mumbai, che è La città color zafferano, Bombay tra metropoli e mito, edito da Bruno Mondadori, e che Gyan Prakash presenterà oggi alle 15:30 al chiostro di San Paolo con Giuliano Milani. Quindi benvenuto Gyan Prakash. Alla sua sinistra invece Siddhartha Deb, scrittore, insegna scrittura creativa alla New School di New York. In Italia è appena uscito, da pochi giorni è uscito il suo ultimo libro, Belli e Dannati, il ritratto della nuova India, edito da Neri Pozza, che contrariamente ai suoi libri precedenti non è un romanzo ma è un saggio, che tra l'altro di cui ci parlerà oggi, che presenteremo questa sera alle 18:30 al chiostro di San Paolo. Infine, quindi benvenuto anche a Siddhartha Deb. Infine il professor Sanjay Reddy, docente di economia alla New School di New York e anche da poco condirettore accademico dell'India China Institute della New School, e si occupa in particolare di povertà e sviluppo. Benvenuto a Sanjay Reddy. Quindi parleremo partendo proprio con il professor Reddy del boom economico, di cui io vi do solo due cifre per darvi un'idea. Il boom è stato generato da una serie di riforme che hanno aperto l'economia indiana a investimenti privati, ha liberalizzato molti settori, e che ha portato la crescita del PIL a cifre vertiginose. Nel 2007 ha raggiunto il picco, il 9%. Una crescita che negli ultimi anni ultimamente si sta arrestando, e adesso infatti vedremo soprattutto quanto è solida rispetto anche al gigante asiatico che è la Cina, quanto è solida e quanto è sostenibile, anche le differenze, perché forse l'economia, la crescita cinese è più, per motivi proprio strutturali, è più solida, è più salda. Invece cosa rischia la crescita cinese? E perché possiamo dire che forse è più fragile, più debole, ha delle basi più fragili. Darei la parola proprio al professor Sanjay Reddy che ci può introdurre questo argomento. Prego.
Buongiorno. Good morning. Thank you, Junko, for that valuable introduction. I am very grateful for this invitation from various points of view. Not least is that my role here is, I think, rather a functional one. I think of myself as the warm-up act for my distinguished colleagues and friends, Siddhartha Deb and Gyan Prakash, who I have much more interesting things to say to you. And they are bona fide, I think they're bona fide literary figures. And this is a festival of ideas, but also of literature. Whereas what I will do is to present you something of a potted history, really as a context with which to think about the observations from a rather different perspective, which they will respectively make. I'm sorry I can't speak to you in Italian, even though I'd like to think of myself as at least a moderate Italophile. I'm afraid I haven't developed the competence to do that. But nevertheless, you do, I'm sure many of you not need translation, but you do have it. And don't hesitate to let me know in due course if anything requires clarification. The story that I want to tell, building upon Junko's remarks, is really about an India of tremendous complexity, for which a single story cannot be told. And this will not surprise those of you who have read about India or visited India. In fact, something of a cliche in certain circles is the sentence attributed to various people, but I think actually due to Joan Robinson, the famous British economist who's well known in Italy, who once said that for everything that is true about India, its opposite is also true. And so, for example, for all of India's vaunted prosperity and increasing prosperity and extraordinary economic growth in recent years on the aggregate level, there is not only, as Junko suggested and as Siddhartha certainly will talk about more, not only another side, but another side which really I think we're forced to consider, even if we want to understand the growth story in India better. Many of you will know that the developing countries as a whole, the so-called developing countries, have been for a number of years now contributing more than half of incremental global growth. That is to say that for the increase in the in global economic activity that is taking place, or of the increase that is taking place, more than half is accounted for by growth in developing countries. And this is something which is very new. And there is no reason to expect that it will change. It's a structural shift which has happened in the global economy as the developed countries' growth rate has diminished and the developing countries' growth rate has expanded. And India and China are, of course, major contributors to this, China first and foremost, and India secondarily, because of their size and their very rapid economic growth in recent years. And obviously this has tremendous implications for the developed countries as well. Increasingly, though I think of myself, used to think of myself as a development economist, at least that's one of my identities concerned with the economics of development, it's not possible to think about the economics of development or the economic situation of the developed countries, as you know, considering them together. The deep interconnections which has taken place. And that is bidirectional. In the past, it used to be thought only that there was a core and a periphery in the world economy, and the core was the train engine and the locomotive, and the periphery was pulled along. But I think increasingly we have bidirectional relationships. If you think about this from the standpoint of business, and many of you may not like to do that, but if you do, then you can see immediately how important is the figure that more than half of global growth is accounted for by growth in developing countries, and in particular in a few developing countries, the large middle-income, so-called middle-income economies, including lower middle-income economies, such as India. By the way, parenthetically, some years ago I was at a conference and somebody told me that India was a middle-income economy, and I was quite disturbed by that because I didn't think anything about India qualified as middle-income. But it turned out that the World Bank had just the preceding year, I think this was in the early 2000s, reclassified India from being a low-income country to a lower middle-income country. And since then, people have been talking about India as a middle-income country, which creates quite a lot of, I think, confusion all around, because the reality of India, which many of us know, does not correspond to that of a middle-income country in many respects. But indeed, its per capita income had passed a threshold which enabled the World Bank to reclassify it as such. But to go back, if you think about this from the point of view of business, the important point is that this is where the business opportunities are. This is where the incremental opportunities are. If one asks the question, for instance, within Europe, why Germany has been doing relatively well, part of the answer is that Germany specializes in the production of capital goods, machine tools, for example, or other such goods which are in turn used in the production process in other countries. This is the heart of the German industrial enterprise. So if Germany is an export powerhouse, and if it has fortunes which have diverged from those of the European periphery, part of the reason is that it is the country which produces the capital goods which go onto the factory floors in these fast-growing emerging economies in the world. And therefore, there's a tremendous interest in those opportunities. And much of the media hype which we hear, whether in The Economist magazine or any other organ, including the more popular organs, is, I think, at least unconsciously driven by this, by the idea that there are these new sites of economic opportunity for Western business. I teach in a university, and very often I will run into students who today think of India as, I'm sure Gyan Prakash and Siddhartha Deb have the same experience, who think of India basically as an opportunity center, a place where they can go for their future careers, and which they ought to know about because of their interest in business or in related matters. I'm reminded also, parenthetically, of a story I read a couple of weeks ago that of an Indian cultural doyen named Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who, when she visited the United States in the 1950s, kept being asked by Americans about snakes. And after some point in time, with irritation, she said, "I've seen many more snakes in America than in India." So that is, of course, well, that experience would be familiar, at least indirectly, to many Indians of the tremendous change in the understanding of India. And arguably, both are equally distortive. And I think part of our task is to find a much more proportionate and adequate picture, notwithstanding Joan Robinson's injunction that for everything that's true about India, its opposite is also true. So, to return to the economics, another cliche about India, which many of you will know, is that for a long period of time, from the late 1940s to the mid-1980s, India experienced what was called the Hindu rate of growth, which was a rather tepid 1.5% to 2% GDP per capita growth. And there were many debates among development economists and others as to why this was so. India having been in many ways a laboratory for development economics, with India's own economists and statisticians having played a very important role in the world debate on development strategy. But that strategy not having, it appeared, from this measure at least, been very successful. What changed in the mid-1980s, purely as a quantitative matter, early to mid-1980s, is that the aggregate growth rate in India began to pick up in a much more sustained way. And it was, well, that began to happen in the early to mid-1980s, but that was still within the context of what was called the license permit Raj, the system of import substituting industrialization, which was very much centered on governmental control of what Nehru called the commanding heights of the Indian economy. And although India was a mixed economy in common with many other economies, developing country economies around the world, with an important role for the public sector but also for the private sector, an economy which had never fundamentally challenged the role of the private sector, even though it had regulated, constrained, and shaped it in various ways. The fact was that the government did play a very crucial role in the channeling of public investment and in the regulation of the forms of investment and so on and so forth. Labor, laws, various realms of economic activity and dimensions of the economic system. There was a partial liberalization which took place in the mid-1980s under Rajiv Gandhi, who came to power after his mother, Indira Gandhi, was assassinated. And that partial liberalization accompanied, some would say was the cause of, some would say it was simply a sidelight, but it accompanied this moderate pickup in the economic growth rate. But by the late 1980s, a macroeconomic crisis had begun to emerge, which was caused by the balance of payments problem, which the economic liberalization Rajiv Gandhi had introduced had brought in train. And that economic crisis really resulted from the fact that Rajiv Gandhi had liberalized imports without creating a sustainable basis for higher foreign exchange receipts to pay for those imports. And many of those imports went into consumer goods. For example, the famous Maruti car, which is a small car which you can see in all over India, and also increasingly exported to middle-income countries around the world, was an example of this, which was manufactured with imported components and assembled. So it was a partial liberalization, very lopsided, and that lopsidedness was part of what arguably led to the crisis, the immediate crisis in the balance of payments, which in 1991 led to the more fundamental, arguably, reconfiguration in the political economy, which is what Junko and others may have in mind very often when they think about the starting point of India's contemporary growth experience. What happened in 1991 was really, I would say, as much a change in the imagination of the economy as it was a practical change. In fact, one could argue that the policy reforms actually introduced in 1991 were not very significant. But the change in the imaginative orientation of the Indian elites and of the Indian polity and economic system was very fundamental. In fact, what happened was that from 1991 onward, there were a series of economic reforms which took place. The basic transformation, I think, arguably, is that India changed its fundamental strategy from one of relying on savings and investment generated domestically to relying at least on the promise of the increasing confidence of foreign investors and of the inward inflow of foreign exchange receipts due to foreign investors' confidence. And of course, the goal was also to shift India from being an economy with an orientation towards self-sufficiency to one which was much more engaged in international trade and could also, at least aspirationally, play much more of a role in the world economy by exporting its goods and services. What has actually happened? Many years ago, in the 1970s, there was a famous article by two economists, one of whom was my former colleague at the New School, Lance Taylor, and a Brazilian economist, collaborator of his, which was called, which featured the metaphor of what they called Bel India. Bel India refers to a Belgium within India. And they explored, in that particular paper, the implications of there being a group of people who were very prosperous and had a very different pattern of consumption from the larger society and economy around them. Now, if in the 1970s there was a Bel India, I think one could argue that today, in part as a result of the Hindu rate of growth, which took place from the mid-1970s onward, but even more as a result of the economic reform process which took place subsequently, or the changes in economic policies which took place subsequently. There have emerged multiple Belgiums within India, multiple islands of prosperity. And the prosperity within these islands can appear quite real, and yet one of the key features of this prosperity is that it is isolated from its individual peripheries and from the larger periphery in India, which is in considerable part rural, but also consists of the urban poor, who are very often disconnected, at least not as fully connected to those centers of prosperity as are others. This model of the emergence of multiple islands of prosperity which are relatively disconnected from their peripheries, I think has enormous implications for India. And it is in many ways connected with the particular nature of the economic growth process which has taken place in India since the mid-80s or the early 1990s. India, unlike China, is not a manufacturing center. And I think this is something which is very crucial for Indians to understand as well as for non-Indians to understand. China has become, as all of you know, the workshop of the world. There's a diorama, a little display in Penn Station in New York, and also I think in Trenton, New Jersey, which Gyan Prakash is probably familiar with, which says, because he probably takes that train fairly often, which says, Trenton makes and the world takes. So that was the way that the East Coast of the United States conceived of itself at one time, as a manufacturing center of the world economy. Trenton takes and the world makes. Who has heard today of Trenton, New Jersey? And I'm sure if one visited Trenton, New Jersey, I've only passed through, one would find not very much evidence that Trenton makes and the world takes. But today it is truly the case that China makes and the world takes. China makes everything and the world takes. So the extraordinary Chinese growth story is, of course, based on the ability of China to emerge as a manufacturing center across a broad range of commodities. Not only labor-intensive commodities, even though the initial labor cost advantage in China was important. What China has brought to bear is, in fact, a totality of resources and of advantages which have diminished the unit costs of production to a point where others cannot easily compete. It's not that they cannot, but they cannot as easily compete. It's lowered the cost curve in economic terms, and it's done so not only, again, by having low labor costs, though it has had low labor costs, and it's engaged in various ways of maintaining low labor costs, including repression of labor, but it has also, for instance, found ways, again and again here, political fiat or political authoritarianism may, in the background, have played a certain role, but it has found ways to lower the costs of power, to provide high-quality infrastructure through which goods can move quite quickly and at low cost, and so on and so forth. Now, India, for a variety of reasons, including the complexity of its democratic system and the constraints which this creates to doing some of the things which China has done, which the Indian capitalist class rues, needless to say, it's not very happy about that, which is why it's always talking about the importance of infrastructure. That infrastructure, which is indeed very poor in India, is viewed as an example of India's asymmetry with China, that where the Chinese state could step in and establish good quality infrastructure, if necessary by razing hutments and demolishing entire slums or areas. In fact, China has never had, in recent decades, slums on the Indian type because of the communist system. But nevertheless, where China could do certain things that India cannot do, India cannot for a variety of reasons, including the nature of democratic politics. And this is viewed as something to be very much regretted by, I think, some elements of the Indian capitalist class. Now, whether or not it is to be regretted, I think it certainly is a fact that India has not been able to do some of the same things, and perhaps it's not had a mind to do some of the same things. For all of these reasons, India has not emerged as a manufacturing center. Of course, India's population is also very different. In China, the population by the mid to late 1970s had a very high rate of literacy, near universal, if not universal, and it also had reached very high life expectancies due to efforts of the Chinese communist regime, such as the barefoot doctors. Nothing comparable is the case in India, has been the case in India, and indeed to the present day, India has very serious problems in the area of health. For example, having child malnourishment rates which are arguably higher than sub-Saharan Africa's, and absolute numbers as well. So you have a very different situation with respect to the capabilities of the population in addition. So India has not emerged as a manufacturing powerhouse. Indeed, it's not emerged as an important manufacturing exporter. But what it has emerged at, as all of you will know, or many of you will know, is as a services exporter. And it's in the very nature of the services being exported, in particular information technology, back office processing for businesses in Europe, North America, and so on, that it requires a certain level of skills, not necessarily a very high level, but a certain level of skills which are typically produced within the middle classes and perhaps the aspirational lower middle classes. So even insofar as these services industries begin to employ more and more people, there are certain prerequisites to whom they can employ, and because of the nature of the businesses, there's only so much labor which they absorb. So it's very much in the nature of the Indian growth process, if one looks at cities such as Bangalore, the city I was born in and come from, for instance, that the centers of prosperity within these cities, or the sectors where the prosperity exists within these cities, are of this type. Very often you'll find young people, Siddhartha has written about this and knows much more than I about it, young people who earn high salaries by the standards of their families and communities, but who might in fact be in rather boring jobs from their point of view, who are doing this activity. And their consumption pattern changes, of course, as a result in part of the kinds of messages to which they're exposed, and becomes rather import intensive. Junko, please tell me when I'm running out of time, because I'm probably going to, or might have. 1 minute?
Yes, 1 minute.
1 minute.
Okay.
So the important point here is that India, so what India has ended up doing is to establish islands of prosperity disconnected from their hinterlands, with an import-intensive pattern of consumption, without exporting a great deal, or certainly not exporting enough, or taking advantage of the potential of its population to do so. So even insofar as India has shifted from an import-substituting model to an export-producing model, it's not done so in a balanced and fully effective way. The consequence, another crucial asymmetry with China, is that India basically imports more than it exports in terms of goods. And that's made up for through the investment receipts which India receives from the rest of the world. From this point of view, for India to maintain foreign investor confidence is all important. And that is a very crucial lens with which to understand the macro politics and economic choices which India is making, including the most recent set of investor-friendly reforms which India has introduced. That's not merely about generating a higher growth rate for the Indian economy, but about pleasing the foreign investors, ensuring their confidence, and making sure that investment receipts keep coming in, which they had stopped doing during the recent crisis, which was a source of enormous concern for India, lest it lead to a repetition of the 1991 crisis, despite the fact there is some buffer now. China, and I'll just finish with this, is in exactly the opposite position. China exports more than it imports, even in terms of goods and services, and so it doesn't need the investment receipts which it gets. That's just icing on the cake, as it were. Siddhartha knows the famous quotation, I'm sure many of you know, and Gyan will know, of Mr. Micawber in Charles Dickens's David Copperfield, which runs roughly that excess of expenditure over income makes for unhappiness, and an excess of income over expenditure makes for happiness, even if that excess is very tiny indeed. And I think that is precisely the contrast between India and China. There's much more to be said on the social side, and in particular about the alternative economic policy strategy which India could follow or could have followed, and how that would really be the key to unlocking both this macroeconomic crisis, potential macroeconomic vulnerability, or avoiding this potential macroeconomic vulnerability, and at the same time bringing about a more equitable and shared prosperity. But I think I will have to leave that to the discussion.
Grazie, grazie. Grazie Sanjay Reddy. Non si sente. Okay. e del percorso che appunto alternativo che l'India potrebbe intraprendere per assicurarsi un futuro più solido. Parleremo sicuramente anche più tardi. Adesso volevo però chiedere a Siddhartha Deb, che tra il 2007 e il 2009 ha girato l'India alla ricerca di storie di questa nuova India, del risultato di questa crescita economica. Lui vive negli Stati Uniti, come vi ho detto prima, però è andato a vedere con i suoi occhi, e il risultato è il libro che è appena uscito, Belli e Dannati, e volevo chiedere a lui di raccontarci che India ha trovato, che paese ha trovato.
Thank you, Junko. You know, it's a hard act to follow coming after Sanjay, but in a way it's also good because it makes it very easy. He's given you sort of this really broad, detailed picture. I really see myself as a storyteller and dealing, obviously, with these questions. And as I think Sanjay put it very well, that it's the new Indian economy, the India shining, as the phrase was coined for a while, was as much an economy of the imagination as it was of material goods and services. So basically, I think in terms of my, before I get into that though, I really want to thank you. This is a very incredible opportunity. It's my first time in Italy. This is my first few days. It is wonderful to see this sort of civic culture, this combination of youth and older people, a kind of engagement with ideas and justice and the environment. Don't underestimate yourself. These things are very, very valuable. It's very hard to sometimes to see their value in the world today. But you know, telling you from an outsider's perspective, this is incredibly wonderful, and that's why it's amazing to be here, rather than to be surrounded with corporate, you know, logos in the background, sometimes of very suspect provenance. So thank you for the opportunity. In terms of my take on the new India, I'd like to say that I grew up in India on the very periphery of India, many thousands of miles from the big cities of Delhi and Calcutta in the sort of northeastern provinces, a border region. And so I had a very angular perspective on India from the very, very beginning. And that is very crucial to my writing, to my thinking about India. I often saw India as a very oppressive presence, for instance, because many of these regions are, it's a very beautiful region, but it's near the border with Tibet, China, Burma, and Bangladesh. And you know, there are insurgencies and conflicts, so there's a lot of, you know, heavy state presence, but not always malign. I mean, there's also some benign aspects to the state being present there. My father worked for the government, so I grew up very far from Delhi, and then I moved to Calcutta to become a student. I was a journalist there, and then I moved to Delhi as a journalist, and then I was in New York, again writing fiction, doing freelance work. So my connections with India have always remained very deep. In some sense, I remain an Indian citizen out of choice. I was writing about India during this boom time from 2003, 2004. And this was the peak, I would say, of that sort of new India. And in 2004, I was sent back. I was asked by the Guardian newspaper in England to do a story on the call centers, and it had really captured the imagination of the West, partly also anxieties that our service jobs are also now disappearing, and people are, they put on headsets like this and they answer our calls. So I took a few, I basically went kind of undercover, and I took a few jobs working for various British and American, and they're, British, Indian, American Indian, these are all multinationals. And I worked for a couple of call center companies, including one for, because my newspaper, The Guardian, was in England, they wanted me to work for a British company, which was hard because when you apply for these jobs, they don't tell you anything. They don't tell you what time, what hours you're going to work, they don't tell you which companies you're going to try and sell. If you ask any questions, they get very impatient. When you get a job and they give you an envelope, a sealed envelope with your offer letter, it's very, very authoritarian. They say, don't open the letter until you get home. So, you're sitting there with this letter that contains your salary and hours, but everybody looks at each other and very nervously at the end of a long day of interviews. And then, you can't actually open the letter and look at it. Anyway, and then I basically I worked in Noida and Gurgaon, which are on the outskirts of Delhi, at different call centers. And one of the main call centers was, I was serving for, I finally found out that I was working for a British company called BT. And my job ultimately after training was to work in cancellations. It was to work with very angry British customers who wanted to cancel their internet accounts. And my job was really, it was an open floor and there were all the clocks around with showing the different times of London, New York, Tokyo, kind of like a hotel, very bright lights. We had 8-hour shifts with half an hour lunch break and one 15-minute break every 4 hours. To use the bathroom or to smoke a cigarette, but you have to ask your permission from your supervisor, and they tell you whether or not you can go. And so you're on a headset like this, and the most important thing I learned was the mute button when you're working on the call center service. So we spoke in, we were speaking to these British customers, and our job was really to convince the customers not to cancel the internet account. Now, they were often very angry because they had been often on hold for many hours and been bounced around to different parts, sometimes from one of the Bangalore center, and then they'd finally been sent to us, to me, and my job is really to cancel, but to sort of actually try to convince them not to cancel. So there was this performance aspect to it, which was very interesting, and we had these trainers who were teaching us how to speak English in a particular way. And the trainers, who were all Indian, had themselves been trained in Dublin. So they'd all come back with these slightly Dublin accents. So it was a very Delhi sort of setting with slightly Dublin accents. Except from time to time, there would be an enraged scream in Punjabi or in Hindi from around the corner. It would be a very loud, sort of abusive word, expletive. And this is not part of the official training, but there was also an unofficial training. The unofficial training was, some of these people who call you are really stupid. They don't know what they want. They don't know the number of their accounts. They don't know their address. They don't know. So there was this somewhat of a hostility. And you will need to let off steam. You will get and some of them will shout at you, which some of them do. Some of them scream at you. You will let off steam, just to survive, because you're going to be doing this for 8 hours. So the unofficial training said that the mute button is very important. And when you get really frustrated, hit the mute button so that the customer can't hear you, and call the customer the worst possible name you can imagine. So this very, very hyper modern sort of atmosphere of clocks and everywhere with a soft murmur of sort of Indian Irish accents. Hello, my name is Siddhartha and this is BT Cancellations. How may I help you? And then suddenly you'll hear from the left, somebody's like, and people look around and say, oh, he's really having a bad day today, So this is how my exploration of the New India began, in some sense, with this story, because the story was quite popular when it came out. But in Delhi, there was this 2004, call centers are going to save India. They are going to, this is the future, call centers, IT. And the numbers, and again, Sanjay is, probably Sanjay and Gyan are much more qualified to talk about numbers than I am. But at the time I was looking at it, the entire industry was employing maybe 1 million people. And perhaps the support services, the security guards, the drivers, and so on, doesn't add up to very many numbers. But when I was doing the story, people among my friends, middle to upper class, educated Indians, they would say, this is great, this is amazing, India is shining, India is booming. And as I was reporting the story, the BJP was the government then in power, the political party in power, coined the slogan, India shining. but they would show not call center workers and IT people, they would show farmers and rural school children sort of in very bucolic surroundings. And this was the My India Shining. And then, of course, in the elections, they lost, because they lost very, very badly, actually, in 2004. So I began this sort of incredible journey, basically, over the years from 2007 and 9 to 9, beginning with the boom. I started in Delhi. I began by looking at the new rich, sort of because the flamboyance of the new India. I thought there were very interesting parallels. I'm very interested in metaphors, you know, because that's what I do. And I thought there were these parallels with the Gilded Age, America, in certain ways. You know, loose parallels, again, as a kind of metaphor to really look at it, because India is completely different after all. But I basically went looking for like a Gatsby-like figure, as in sort of Scott Fitzgerald, a kind of mysterious person who's made a lot of money. And arguably I found such a character, but I also hung out with the new rich garment exporters and cigar dealers, and I would sort of go hang out with them at night in their BMWs, and we would go to this sort of nightclubs, car dealers. I learned a lot about luxury items. I didn't know anything about them. I learned about things like Vertu cell phones, which cost, you know, I don't know, $50,000, and Bentley cars, and so on and so forth. And then I went to Bangalore to look at the engineering, the IT crowd, the middle class, which has also benefited from this boom in quite a, you know, obvious way, and are great supporters of this new India, this shining India. And I looked at that in a few characters. And then I would say I began to, you know, so I looked at Delhi, I looked at Bangalore, I went to Hyderabad, very prosperous urban economies. And then from Hyderabad, I went into the countryside. And Sanjay actually, you know, I know from a long way back, helped me a lot with, you know, with my reporting in Andhra Pradesh in the south, because there was a very, it is in the south, and it's not a place I was familiar with. I grew up almost entirely on the upper half of India. But I wanted to, you know, look at a new place. And then I went to the farmers. And perhaps I'll tell you one story to sort of conclude, sort of, you know, and then we can talk at the more complex things. So I began to go to Hyderabad, and this is still the boom. And Hyderabad is a very important information technology center, but it's also a very, quite a politically progressive place. It's full of ideas. But, you know, there's violence, there's policing, it has a very strong tradition with the ultra-left sort of, you know, not guerrillas who are in central India now. Anyway, so I went with an activist and an academic to a village. It was called Kazi Palli. Maybe 40 kilometers out of Hyderabad. And Hyderabad is like IT central. There is even something called an IT city, and so on and so forth. And this friend of mine took me to this village, and we went past all the signs of New India, the IT centers, the shopping malls, the pharmaceutical labs, and so on. And there was a lot of construction happening. This is one of the things you see in India, very semi-finished sort of construction. And then we were in this village, and then he introduced me to these villagers, and the villagers sort of took me to this lake. And we had to climb a little hill to get to the top of and look down at the lake. And when we climbed the top of the hill, I couldn't stand there because my eyes started watering, and I couldn't breathe because the lake was filled with effluents. And the whole village was surrounded by factories which were dumping their effluents into the lake. This village was at least 400 years old. People traced back there, and these were not beaten down villagers. These were people who were educated, they had demonstrated, they'd been beaten up, they'd taken a court case, they'd taken up cases in court, the cases had been, you know, were hung up in court, saying that, you know, our villages, we shouldn't have effluents dumped into our lake. We can't grow anything on our agricultural land. We would ask them, I said, why can't you grow? And they would say, in Hindi, they would say it burns, the plants die out, they get burnt, basically, the soil is so bad. And we was talking to the villagers near this road cutting to the village, and not only are there effluents, there are these explosions that are happening from the side. You can hear explosions in the background because there's quarrying going on this stone quarrying going on, and illegal. The quarries are illegal, but it's happening openly. And so while we are talking with the effluence behind us and these explosions, and there are trucks going by with little teenage boys covered in dust, carrying the stone, and the villagers are saying, what should we do? We've tried everything. And this is what the new India. And then as I'm coming back from the village, a little bus passes by, and it has this logo on the side saying METAS, Special Economic Zone. And we can talk about what a special economic zone is later. But I just see the name. I vaguely recognize the name, METAS, M-A-Y-T-A-S. And then when I go back to Hyderabad, I see advertisements, hoardings for METAS expensive housing. And it says the tagline, the slogan, very ironically, is, I think it says, more chlorophyll, more green, is the tagline for METAS housing. So this is the boom years. I go back a year later again to Hyderabad. This time I'm going further to look at talk to factory workers. And what has happened is, I realized, what did Sanjay say? That one lovely quote, everything about India, the opposite is also true. METAS is connected to one of the biggest IT companies in Hyderabad called Satyam, and it has collapsed because of an Enron-like accounting fraud. And METAS, which is Satyam reversed, basically, as a journalist in Hyderabad pointed out to me. METAS, that hoarding that I saw, that whole luxury housing, I visited, and it's filled with very rich people desperately wiring and plumbing their own apartment. They've hired their own labor because this whole thing has been seized, but might be seized by the government to pay off the larger debts accrued by the company. So in a year, I had seen the same thing go from boom to bust, and begin to affect even the new rich and the middle class. And by the time I came back to the city, even the call center jobs, people do it, and you see them, you see these young people, but it's no longer a way out. They see it as something, it's a short term. It's become more expensive to live in the cities, so the salaries that were very good in 2004, they're not quite as good, even though they've gone up, they can't keep pace because the cities have become very expensive, food has become very expensive. So in some sense, even though I didn't plan it, just the reporting of the book went from the peak, from this sort of boom, to the beginning of, I would say, the contradictions, which are becoming even more evident now. And I really want to stop there and let Gyan take over, and so that we have time for discussions.
Okay, thank you. Bene, al professor Prakash invece vorrei chiedere, visto che lui appunto si occupa di problematiche legate all'ambiente urbano, come questa crescita che tipo di impatto ha avuto questa crescita sugli spazi urbani, sulla popolazione che abita le grandi città indiane. Sono nate anche nuove città, appunto, si sono sviluppate degli hub di information technology. Il professor Prakash ha appena scritto questo libro su Bombay. Prego.
Thank you, and like everyone else, I'm really pleased to be here. And actually, when I walked in, I thought I might have to break into aria here, but I will not. It's true that some of these changes that both of you have talked about can be seen in a particularly sharp way in many of the large cities in India. And I've been working in Mumbai on my book for nearly 8 years, from 2000 to 2008. I've spent a great deal of time in Mumbai. And one of the things that Sanjay spoke about, which was how the new economy was defined as much by imagination as by real policy changes, is particularly true in Mumbai. And in a way, it's been part of Mumbai's history, where the status of the city or the imagination of the city as a place of possibility, a place of realizing your dreams has been there for a very long time. What happened since, of course, 2000 was that this idea of that we are in a new economy and there are all kinds of possibilities that are new, it became very widely disseminated. And you can see different aspects of it in a city like Mumbai. So, for example, on the one hand, there is a very famous and well-known, probably the richest Indian businessman called Mukesh Ambani. And he has this very large company, a Reliance group of industries and finance, and they're into all sorts of different industry, from petrochemicals to textiles to everything. Now, he decided some years ago that his family needed a new home. And so he built a new home. It was supposed to be, since we are now in 21st century, he's very environmentally conscious. So he decided to make a very green building, a very environmentally friendly building. Except this environmentally friendly building for one family is 27-story high. It has parking space for about 300 cars. It has its own screening room. It has a staff of about 200 people. And it's in a part of the city where it's really a tower. And, I've often called it as a gated community in the sky. So, in a way, the building tells you that it is turning its face away from the city and going up, creating a world of its own, reaching upwards. So that's one side of the aspiration or the new kind of economy that one finds in a city like Mumbai. But, through the time that I've been going to Bombay, there were many other reminders of other aspects of the city. So in 2005, while I was in the city, large parts of the city became completely flooded. There was a huge downpour of rain for one day. This was 25th July 2005. And large parts of the city really went underwater. It was something like what happened in Katrina in New Orleans. The sight of a city underwater is mythic. It's a kind of, it's got a biblical image of, things going under. And the whole city went, completely chaotic. It recovered. In 2006, when I was in Bombay, there was a series of train bombings. Then 2008, when I was there, then, of course, there was that terrorist attack on the train station and the hotels. And my friends in Bombay kept saying that, you better stop coming to Bombay because every time I go there, there was something like this happening. But it told you that there is a whole other side of the city which has to do with politics, and it has to do with increasing sharpening of conflicts which were based on ethnic identities, and they were largely being promoted by sort of right-wing Hindu parties in Bombay. So that was another side of the city, and it has some connection to the economic change that is occurring. Now, one thing that has happened as a result of economic change is the emergence of a very large number of, the young people with aspirations. And these are people, I would even call them post-political, in the sense that they have not had any kind of political experience. And they've been caught up in cities like Delhi, and in many other major cities, they've been caught up in the anti-corruption movement. And they've been fed the idea that the only thing holding India back is its political class, that the political class has become so corrupt that only a whole-scale sort of cleaning of the political system and its replacement by people who are outside politics. And these are, the idea, these would be, civic leaders of various kind, basically educated elites, that they would come and they would clean up politics because the political system is really, really dirty. Now, it's not surprising that this campaign against corruption has also coincided with a general democratization of politics, that in the last 20 years, more and more people from more modest backgrounds, from lower castes, have participated in Indian politics. And one reaction of the elites has been to say that the political system has become thoroughly corrupt and degraded. And the only answer is this. Now, it's interesting that many of the people who are caught up in this new anti-corruption movement are the young people, and many of them the first-generation educated people. I'll give you one example. I was in Delhi in 2010 when there was a whole 2011, sorry, there was a whole mobilization against corruption. And one day I was going in my sister's car, and there was a driver who was driving. And so he was driving, and he took the wrong turn. And I said, oh, you had to take left. He said, oh, I'm sorry, I have this Anna Hazare, who was the leader of this movement. He said, I have Anna Hazare on my mind. I said, why? He said, there's too much corruption. And we need to get these politicians out. There's too much, the prices are rising, inflation is exploding. So I asked him, well, how is corruption connected to inflation? He said it's all connected. You see, these politicians, they get elected, and once they are in power, they get money from all these businessmen, and then, they raise the prices, and so the only hope is we have to correct this. So I said, so are you going to this protest demonstration? He said, yes, I'm going. He said, you see, we middle-class people. Now, for a moment, that was a kind of a little surprise for me, his self-identification as we middle-class people. So he said, look, we middle-class people, we stay away from politics. We think that we have to earn our living and we have to go to office, we have to work. We don't pay attention to politics. And because we middle-class people don't pay attention to politics, these politicians have become, too corrupt. He said, the other day, there was this man who was really poor, from, eastern part of India. He said, from Bihar, which is known as, in popular imagination as kind of a poor area of Bihar. He said, there was this man from Bihar, and he was going to the demonstration. And I said to him, why are you going to the demonstration? Don't you have to work? I mean, if you don't work, how will you put food on the table? And this man said to me, whatever happens, I have to go to the demonstration because we have to clean politics. So the driver then said, when he said that, I realized that we middle-class people, we don't pay attention, and there's this poor guy. He's paying attention to politics, and so I must go. Now, these are, this class of people who are, as I said, sort of first-generation educate, they have aspirations, and they have no political experience, and in a way have turned away from politics, and they now become a kind of, shock troops of this new anti-corruption movement, which is and I think is actually anti-political, in many ways anti-democratic as well. And that's been part of this new transformation that's occurred. Now, I don't want to just say that all the expressions of the new economy are negative. I mean, some of the things that I've discovered and found in Mumbai, for example, you know, it's a famous slum area called Dharavi, which is known as Asia's largest slum. Actually, is now Asia's second largest slum because the first one is in Karachi. For Indians, that's very important, you know. The largest slum is in Pakistan, not in our country. Now, one of the things that in Dharavi you find is there is a tremendous amount of optimism. If you see the condition under which people actually live, with barely any civic facilities, you know, there are open drains, there's no educational facility, there's no health facility, there's no credit facility, and yet, in spite of all these disadvantages, people in Dharavi, which is a kind of slum of about 800,000 people live in a very small area. It's very congested, it's densely packed, it's dirty, it's chaotic, and yet they have actually created a very vibrant, dynamic life over there, in spite of lack of any facilities. And if you see Dharavi today, Dharavi's success is not owed to any planner, it's not owed to any state subsidy, it's built entirely on the initiative of the people. I'll give you an example. If you go there, among many things that you can purchase, it's a very thriving leather market where people, you know, you'll go to any shop after shop, they'll make on order within a day a jacket, a bag, a belt, whatever you want. And after they've made it, they'll also give you a choice. Do you want Versace? Do you want Dolce Gabbana? You know, whatever is your fancy, they'll provide that label for you. And they also have, you know, many of these people are not educated. They may be literate, but they're not really properly educated. But they have a tremendous knowledge of the world to the extent that they require it. So they know, you know, what are the major designers in the world. They know how commodities move. And they utilize that knowledge in order to create a very kind of a dynamic form of life. I mean, if you want to see free enterprise, that's the place you see a free enterprise, you know, built completely on their own, and yet maintaining a very vibrant sense of community and social solidarity. So, for example, if you go to a leather shop, and if they don't have what you require, he'll send somebody to the shop next door or to someone he knows, and they will produce it for you. It doesn't matter that the other person is a competitor, because they have a kind of a sense of cooperation in the place. Dharavi is also a place where, you know, it's a center of recycling. They'll recycle everything, including wrapper of chewing gum, from cans, I mean, you name it. And there are places in Dharavi which are layered with things that people have discarded. And you will find little children picking these things up. Then you have people who have specialized in actually being able to determine which can is fit for recycling and which can is not. Where, you know, steel is mixed with some other item and therefore they cannot recycle it, and where it is, you know, unadulterated. And you have these, people about 13, 14, 15, they can look at a can, they can look at a bottle, just from their sight, they're able to tell whether it can be recycled. And it's a wonderful sight. You see people, throwing things in these different heaps, and slowly these kind of recycling heaps are then taken in a sack by somebody else. It's a very, very efficient system. Now, I don't want to romanticize the life in Dharavi because it's extremely, extremely difficult. But the interesting thing about it is that if you look at the history of Dharavi, it used to be a swamp. And this swamp was basically made habitable by these people. And now that it's been made habitable, it sits next to a corporate center called Bandra Kurla Complex. Suddenly the value of this slum land has shot up. And people who are in the corporate sector are eyeing this. And now there is a scheme called Dharavi Development Project, which is basically a scheme for land sharks. And the idea is that this area, which has been actually developed by these poor people, will be taken over by commercial developers, and they will provide supposedly better equipped tenements for the people who live there, and the rest of the area would be developed for commercial purposes. And in a way, this is also a history of many of these cities where you find the immigrants who have come to the city have developed part of the city, and then once it's developed, then the land sharks move in and occupy the land, and then soon you have high-rise towers and shopping malls and so on. So what you find here is people who create kind of lives and working lives in places like Dharavi. And one's usual image of a slum as a place of despair, squalor, disease, all those ideas would be completely disproved if you actually go there. Because it's not a place of despair. It's not a place of, people being pessimistic. They are people with great deal of optimism. So in that sense, you could say that they share this idea of optimism which is there, the new imagination of the economy. They share that. But they do it, and they've done it themselves without any help from the state or the planners. Maybe I'll stop here and then.
Sì, volevo aggiungere. I wanted to add something. Dharavi è in effetti studiata da economisti e urbanisti occidentali, vista come un modello. Però mi chiedo se, mi sembra appunto di capire che anche Gyan Prakash sia pur non romanticizzando la visione di questo che comunque è uno slam per quanto efficiente. Comunque lo sostiene come modello, sostiene anche lei che è un modello, però sappiamo che appunto essendo uno slam ci sono condizioni di vita e anche di lavoro, perché producono, in questa baraccopoli si produce merce per $1 miliardo all'anno, e quindi c'è chi dice che se Dharavi verrà rasa al suolo, se verranno applicati piani di sviluppo per farci un aeroporto, per farci dei mall, dei grandi magazzini, insomma se sarà rivalutata l'area, l'economia stessa di Mumbai, per l'economia stessa di Mumbai sarà una grande perdita. Però può essere davvero un modello, o si tratta di un modello da cui trarre degli spunti per poi sviluppare delle realtà più sostenibili, ecco, anche dal punto di vista di condizioni di vita e di lavoro.
You know, there is a sociologist who has called places like Dharavi unintended cities, that these were not supposed to be intended. But people who live in Dharavi provide absolutely vital services to the city by producing all these goods, by recycling. You know, somehow the upper and, upper middle class and elites in India, almost all of them have servants or domestic help in India. And I don't know what they think where these people would live. So they never think that, these people would also need places to actually have a roof over their heads. And so they build, while serving the city, they build these areas which become slums. And of course, the state or the city never provides any civic facilities to them. Now, without any help, they've created a certain pattern of life in places like Dharavi, which has connections between, the life of work and home life. And those are very closely connected. So, they usually live where they work. There is a kind of a urban planning that you can see at work in these places. The problem is that, when state planners, they go into these places, they don't actually recognize the planning that is in place, that is actually at work over there. They only come with plans which is either from the World Bank, and usually, they have names like Slum Rehabilitation Project. So the idea very much is that these people are not supposed to be here, and we have to somehow rehabilitate them, rather than actually recognizing the pattern of life that they have established, and a very vibrant pattern of life. Now, what they do require is, civic facilities, they require credit, they require health, they require education, schools. Rather than providing those and fitting them into the pattern that is already established, the planners come from the outside and want to demolish this, clear that, and it'll be a disaster. People in Mumbai actually depend on the services that Dharavi provides. But, the planners, partly, they don't recognize it. It's like, when Brasilia was built in Brazil, so they built these apartments without any provision for people who would actually work in these apartments. So soon, around Brasilia grew up these kind of shanty towns. And now, you could say Brasilia actually functions, but it functions because people, worked against the planners, ideal and created something new. It's the same thing with Dharavi, that so long as the planners do not recognize that the planning that is there from below, that is actually already there, and provide, facilities to improve them, it'll be a disaster.
E chiedo anche agli altri ospiti, a Sanjay Reddy in particolare come economista, Dharavi, quello che Dharavi è rispetto a Mumbai, Dharavi essendo la capitale dell'economia informale, quello che Dharavi è come centro di economia informale rispetto a Mumbai è un po' una metafora di quello che è l'economia del resto del paese. La grandissima parte della crescita del paese viene dall'economia informale. Quindi mi chiedo anche, rispetto alle riforme, recentemente il governo ha presentato un nuovo pacchetto di riforme per liberalizzare ulteriormente alcuni settori, in particolare il settore della vendita al dettaglio, aprendo quindi le porte del paese alle grandi economie, alle grandi, scusate, catene di supermercati stranieri, cosa che ha fatto infuriare gran parte, insomma, della popolazione, perché questo significherebbe, secondo appunto i critici, togliere lavoro a milioni di persone, quindi i piccoli venditori al dettaglio. Anche rispetto appunto alle riforme da poco introdotte, e per cui il premier Manmohan Singh si è anche giocato il principale alleato della coalizione di governo. Che cosa, cioè, il fatto che la gran parte dell'economia, della crescita economica arrivi dall'informale, che cosa significa? Che futuro può essere questo il futuro? Come inglobare invece nell'economia formale questo, la maggioranza poi dell'economia del paese?
Thank you, Junko. You made a number of important connections, and I'm very glad that you posed the question of Dharavi as a microcosm of the larger question. I think you're exactly right that and Gyan Prakash is exactly right that the problem of Indian planning and development strategy for a long time, but also in the recent phase, has been the failure to recognize the real sources of dynamism and actual or potential productivity in the Indian economy and society. Creativity, I include in that. It's not just a question of productivity, but creativity as the sites of those things that they are. And this has led to a narrowness in the understanding of what the approach should be. I would not necessarily view the question as one of how to transform informality into formality, although that can be an important thing to do for certain reasons. It's one of the interesting features of the Indian economy is that while everything else has changed, or many things have changed, the proportion of workers who are classified as working in the organized sector, to use the Indian terminology, has stayed exactly constant at roughly 10% for 40 years. So there is an imperviousness of this basic, or an unshiftability of this basic fact of the Indian economy. And that has to do with various things, but indeed, as Gyan mentioned, there are lots of activities which are in the unorganized sector, which are actually very important. They have interlinkages to what's going on in the formal sector. There's enormous contribution to output involved. Now, Dharavi is in a special situation in one sense, which is that it's in Bombay, which is an extremely, well, one of these islands of prosperity, and probably for that reason much more interlinked. But I think the basic question is, how can one create enabling conditions for the vast majority of people living in rural areas, living in small towns, living in various parts of India, and this similar question arises in other such countries, to enable them to take advantage of the opportunities which they might not be able to take advantage of, and to create opportunities, equally important, new opportunities which may not be easily conceived by planners. I think that one important distinction which Atul Kohli, a colleague of Gyan Prakash, makes in a recent book of his, which we should keep in mind, is the distinction between being pro-market and pro-business. This is also, by the way, a distinction made by Luigi Zingales, the Italian economist based in the US, with an entirely different purpose. But I think that there are a lot of things that one can do in India which can be pro-market and pro-people, which are not narrowly pro-business. And those would involve creating these enabling conditions. You know, Gyan Prakash mentioned credit. Credit is one of them. But all the things which enable people to be productive actors. One additional and last thing I'll say on that is that India's historical position in world trade negotiations has been that agriculture is a special subject which should be treated differently from other sectors of production, for the reason that it is simultaneously a sector which produces a commodity which can enter into national or international trade, and it is a source of livelihood for the mass of people, and indeed for a very long time for the majority of the Indian people, remains so. because this too is one of the things which has changed very, very slowly. And I think this idea that there is this duality, that there can be many things which are simultaneously sectors of production and sources of livelihood, and that therefore all the things which influence the quality of the livelihoods which are generated, not just now but over time, and create the possibilities of dynamism therein, is a very, very important one, which the government of India, I think, has failed to acknowledge adequately in various other sectors of production, and indeed in agriculture itself. Despite this stance at the level of international negotiations, the truth is, and this is something I didn't have time to talk about, but I think it's very, very important to mention, that the public investment in agriculture, the enabling conditions for participation of people in rural areas in the market economy, but more generally for productivity and prosperity, have been neglected. A very serious neglect of the things which really matter in rural areas, which we've known from the time of the great development economist Arthur Lewis, who also taught at Princeton, where Gyan Prakash teaches onward, has a complementary relationship to growth in the urban sectors. That has been largely neglected.
Bene, grazie. Grazie Sanjay Reddy. Gyan Prakash ha parlato prima appunto della cosiddetta classe media e trovo molto significativo l'episodio del tassista che si è riconosciuto, si è autodefinito un membro della classe media. La classe media fino a appunto prima dell'inizio del boom economico era molto ristretta, lo è tuttora, però uno dei risultati della grande crescita economica è stata proprio la crescita esponenziale di questa classe media, che poi è quella di cui parlava anche Siddhartha Deb, che lavora nei call center, gli ingegneri informatici, ovviamente parliamo di classe media più alta e più bassa, comunque. Appunto questa classe che ha seguito il movimento anticorruzione di Anna Hazare nel 2011, di cui parlava sempre Gyan Prakash, e Siddhartha Deb, se non sbaglio, in un suo articolo ha criticato l'atteggiamento di questa classe media, che ha partecipato numerosa dietro questo leader che con modi così populisti ha dichiarato guerra alla classe dei politici corrotti. E secondo Siddhartha le motivazioni dei seguaci di Anna Hazare, che hanno riempito le strade di molte città in India, sono motivazioni egoistiche, nel senso che non sono scesi in piazza per chiedere la fine delle diseguaglianze, per mettere sul tavolo i 1000 problemi che il paese ha, ma sembra che siano scesi in piazza sì contro la corruzione come unico ostacolo al proseguire della crescita economica e del loro benessere, perché di questa crescita economica soprattutto loro hanno goduto, non la stragrande maggioranza della popolazione, per cui sostanzialmente non è cambiato molto. E quindi questa è una critica che in realtà non solo Siddhartha ha fatto, ma è arrivata da molti. Quello che mi chiedo e che vorrei chiedere a voi, secondo voi non è proprio da questa nuova classe emergente che non ha più bisogno di lottare per sopravvivere e quindi può permettersi di pensare anche a nuovi valori e di lottare per nuovi valori, e da questa parte della popolazione che può arrivare il traino, la spinta per un cambiamento. Cioè di fatto sono scesi in piazza per un motivo forse appunto egoistico, un po' dall'orizzonte ristretto, però non può arrivare da loro questa spinta anche nei confronti della politica, non solo come classe corrotta, ma soprattutto in questo momento come immobile, perché di fatto probabilmente a causa delle elezioni in vista nel 2014 la politica è completamente ferma. Queste riforme che Singh adesso ha fatto probabilmente sono state una mossa per dimostrare ai critici che lo accusavano di non fare nulla, per dimostrare un guizzo di volontà di fare qualcosa. Non so chi vuole rispondere. Siddhartha? Please.
Well, the anti-corruption movement began to, it sort of peaked at a certain moment with Anna Hazare. Before Anna Hazare, one of his associates is a man called Baba Ramdev, who is a very interesting sort of television guru, who was almost a little quasi-millennial figure in some ways, and clearly tapping, I mean, there are class differences among them and regional differences. And India, I think the regional question is very, very, very important always, because it's such a big place with so much difference. But yes, there's a lot of anxiety, even among the middle class. There's often a kind of frustration with what they would call the lack of infrastructure. But the middle class, I feel, the nature of it has changed over the last 20 years. One is it has benefited materially from the new economy. Two, it is very pleased in some ways to feel that it's catching up with the West, and the West is a very important point of reference. And arguably the United States more than Europe, which is why something like Walmart becomes of such symbolic value. Walmart is already there as a wholesaler, but the presence of Walmart as a retailer becomes of symbolic value. It's this mentality that this is the way to become modern. Oh, this is what when you talk to the engineers, or even the aspiration of the middle class. I will have a car. I will have 2 children. I will drive to my cash and carry, and the cash and carry will be Walmart. And there's a genuine, often embarrassment on their part for places like Dharavi. And people who would talk about Dharavi in positive terms would be critiqued as Jolawalas or as romanticizing because there's a genuine embarrassment that this is not modern. So the anti-corruption movement, a lot of this flows into the anti-corruption movement. And the emphasis is always on politicians and bureaucrats, which is interesting. But if you look at something like, say, a political scandal that broke out a couple of years ago, it involved the income tax department in India tapped the telephone of this British Indian lobbyist called Neera Radia, and it was all about price fixing, seats. But the nexus was between the politicians, who are undoubtedly corrupt, also the media, the journalists, who are the biggest supporters of the anti-corruption movement, and the corporate class, which is never talked about. So there's always something, they're always focusing on the politics, the politicians, and the bureaucrats. And sometimes, I would agree with what Gyan says, that, there's something anti-political. The unease is that they represent mass democracy, the great unwashed masses. There's a kind of anger about that. And the anti-corruption movement focused incredibly on creating a kind of, a Jan Lokpal, a tribune, who would have great policing powers. The problem in India is not that we don't have police. There's enough police. There's too much police. We need more democracy and less police. But the middle class would like more police, less democracy. They will critique the state, except for the army. They will never critique because they're very nationalistic. I mean, if you want to, reduce the state, why not ask the state to withdraw its military from the northeast or from Kashmir or from Chhattisgarh if we want to be critical of the state? I'm all for that. I'm quite anti-statist when it comes to the military. But they don't want that. They would like that to remain in place the policing, while they are left alone in their enclaves. And that's why I'm so critical. There's a kind of real imaginative deficit, and they cannot be blamed alone. This is, again, part of a larger global discourse. There's a kind of, language and a kind of epidemic of a particular kind of thought that has been sweeping the world for the last 15, 20 years, and they've got very caught up in this, the middle class.
You want to add something?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, sorry. Sanjay first.
Would you like to go first?
I
Okay.
was just going to draw
Okay.
a parallel here between what's happening in India in terms of the critique of the state and government, whereas corporate corruption and corporate scandal is completely exempted from any criticism, which is very similar to the Tea Party movement in the United States, which has, concentrated all its fire against the government, and the government is the root of all problem. But 2008, this huge economic crisis that completely devastated the world economy, including Italy, and the role that the bankers played in that is not even part of their agenda of criticism. So you see this completely sort of imbalance in the way in which, and I think this has to do with the ideology of the market, how that the market is, or free enterprise is the solution to all problems, how endemic this has become. And this has led to, criticism of the state, but, exemption of the corporations.
Well, first, just quickly to respond to Gyan, it is important to remember that India was not hit by the crash of 2008 in the way many countries were, and the Indian banking sector was seen as relatively secure and so on. Now, whether or not that will continue if there's a deepening or a second or third phase of the crisis globally is not so clear. But in the short term, that was certainly the perception in India and outside India. And so the sense that the market is still delivering the goods, whereas government is not, is, I think, is a very crucial part of the background perception here. But I just wanted to say, while I agree with many of the things, in fact, I think I could even say I agree with all of the things, I think, that both of my colleagues said. At the same time, I want to take a slightly different view in the sense of complementing what they've said with perhaps a little bit more positive perception of the anti-corruption movement. See, I think, and Gyan Prakash is a distinguished historian who has contributed to the literature which exactly argues, I think, that along the lines that I think we should think about this movement, that any social movement of this kind involves a complex concatenation of interests, many of which are indecipherable one to the other, and which may come nominally in the description of the press or of historians or of others under a particular heading. But it doesn't mean that the subjective self-perception of the participants can be brought under that heading neatly. And I think that it is as true of this movement as any significant social movement. And I think there are elements of a genuine social movement in it, that there is this complex grouping or concatenation of interest. Now, I happened to be in Delhi during one of the, I think in April 2012, one of the crescendos of this movement, one of the phases which Anna Hazare had gone on a hunger strike and then ended his hunger strike. And it was very notable that there was a great difference in the media representation on television, in particular in the more neoliberal wings of the television media of the movement, which very much centered on middle class, indeed I would say upper middle class support for the movement, English speaking often, also the Hindi channels. And the reality in some sense on the ground, I went to Jantar Mantar the day after he finished the hunger strike. There were still lots and lots of people who were there, you could say the hardcore and or the dregs of the demonstration. Many, many people of different kinds. I don't think it would be easy when looking at those people and the various groupings they represented to say that they were an elite formation. Quite the contrary. And I know you may not be saying that, but I think the reality, and your anecdote about the driver, Gyan, also very much brings this out. That is that there is a deep strand of distemper in India about the state is, and this also is in consonance with what you're saying, Siddhartha, the state is an extractive power. The state is as one which opposes one's interests in day-to-day life and acts as an inhumane, extractive authority at different levels in different ways, whether from the smallest clerk who demands a bribe to, or the most distant face of the state that one reads about in the form of the ministers taking bribes apparently in the orders of billions of dollars, maybe amounting to tens of billions of dollars, truly unprecedented amounts. So I think there are different reasons that different people have this concern. And in my view, whatever one thinks of the Anna Hazare movement specifically, and it does have anti-democratic dimensions to it in its favoring of technocracy, on the technocratic aspects, I don't think it can be called simply an anti-democratic movement. In some ways, its demand is rather pedestrian, which is to create a new wing in the Indian constitutional order, which will have certain kind of powers, the Jan Lokpal. And if that were conceded, I'm not sure it would change that much, actually, contrary to the views of those of the people involved in the movement. So it's asking for a modification, one might even say, to be a little bit provocative, a minor modification of the organs in the Indian constitutional order. And it is true that there are anti-democratic impulses in part which animate that, but I don't think on behalf of, on the part of everyone. So looked at in a broader historical process of the kinds of aspirations and transformations which are involved here, yes, and there's an anti-democratic dimension. There's also, however, a democratic element in the receptivity the movement has received. And I think the critique of the movement by the, let's say, the intellectuals, the social movement intellectuals, such as Arundhati Roy, or the party intellectuals on the left, although well taken, I think doesn't capture some aspects of the mood.
Okay, grazie.
Can I respond quickly?
Just 1 minute.
Yeah, I think, Sanjay, the people, they might be there and they might be suffering genuine distress, but they would not be eligible to stand to become the Jan Lokpal. That is my point. The bill excludes specifically politicians, which is a very interesting point, which seems to suggest that those who are elected are somehow extra suspect. It excludes specifically politicians. It emphasizes people who are educated, judges, and Magsaysay Award winners or Nobel laureates. It is a very upper middle class idea of virtue, that speaking English or having an education qualifies you. Those people would be excluded from this position of the great policeman, basically. That's all I want to say.
Okay, grazie. Bene, abbiamo credo veramente pochi minuti per rispondere alle domande dal pubblico, se qualcuno... Ok, qui abbiamo una...
We have in the Indian fashion gone on too long.
Io faccio una domanda che si collega con la situazione italiana. Sì?
Prego, prego.
E allora in Italia abbiamo dei settori dell'imprenditoria e dei settori dell'economia che sembrano vivere in una bolla di privilegio. Faccio l'esempio della Fiat che diminuisce i diritti dei lavoratori contravvenendo anche le leggi che sono in vigore. Parlo delle acciaierie di Taranto, dove da decenni sembra che la direzione dell'azienda sia esentata dai doveri verso la collettività e il governo si appresta a varare un nuovo decreto salva tutti, salva privilegi. Allora volevo sapere se in India, di cui conosciamo quell'estremo drammatico di Bhopal, la situazione per quello che riguarda le grandi imprese, sia indiane sia quelle venute con gli investimenti stranieri, diciamo, ha migliorato la situazione, oppure ci sono delle aree diciamo, di privilegio poco tollerabili.
Well, you might have followed, perhaps, I'm not sure if it was reported here in Italy, the very interesting, the wildcat strike which happened recently in one of the factories of the Maruti company, which I mentioned earlier, which manufactures the small cars, Maruti Suzuki, and in one of the major sites in Manesar outside Delhi. And this was actually the most dramatic of a series of wildcat strikes which have been happening over time. And in fact, in Gurgaon, there's been a number of them as well. There was an earlier incident where there was an Italian company, in fact, operating there, whose Indian manager was killed in an altercation. So there is not very a positive atmosphere on the ground in some of these factories, in the manufacturing sector in particular, even though the workers in question are earning reasonably good salaries by their own historical standards. And I think that this reflects an increasingly conflictual relationship between workers and employers, in part as a result of the dismantling of the more protective regime of labor which previously existed, which had its problems, including its favoring of insiders and some of the difficulties that created, and its creation of a two-class system of labor. But there is still a two-class system of labor de facto. In fact, a three-class system, because in the same factories, what you have are the workers who come in under the old regime, who were hired previously, workers who are on contract, short-term employment, whose contracts cannot be renewed at any point, and so who can easily be gotten rid of, flexibilized workers, and then those who don't have this employment at all in the broader informal sector, let's say the people who run the tea shop or work in the tea shop next to the factory. So you have all of this. And this is not different from Italy. It's not different from America. This is globalization of the last 25 years, or 35 years, this gradual transformation of employment systems and production systems in favor of flexibilization, and away from the old regimes of protection of labor. Now, as you know, in the debate in Europe and elsewhere, there's been a discussion about how what is sometimes euphemistically called flexibility, which has some content to it as well as some obscurantism to it, labor market flexibility and flexibility for firms in their decisions to hire and fire workers and where to have production and so on, can be combined with security for workers. And I think that this is an unsolved problem. But the foregrounding of the demand for flexibility is very much a part of this transformation, and it has worked in a way which is very pro-capital, pro-employer. And I think that in India, there's a kind of sterility of the discourse, not just in India, but in India certainly one important case, in which every question is addressed as an either-or. Should we have more or should we have less? When in fact there are many more dimensions to the problem, many more subtle ways one can think about the problem. And if you pose the question as more versus less, then it becomes one of stereotype versus stereotype. And of course, the interests of business want more, everything, more flexibility, more deregulation, so on and so forth, more reduction of tax burden. This is, I think, again, too simplistic a way of viewing the problem. So I just want to say, the questions in Italy, the questions in India, they're not dissimilar. This is true for many of the issues we're discussing. Corruption was one of them, and labor and employment is another.
Grazie. Sì, brevissimo perché abbiamo purtroppo pochissimo tempo, abbiamo un po' sforato, colpa mia.
I'm an Italian journalist. Well, referring to what you were saying now about comparison Italy and India, Karl Marx said that while working as a journalist for an American newspaper, that India is an Italy of Asiatic dimensions, and maybe he was not too wrong. Anyway, referring to what you were saying, in order to make an assessment, we talked about the anti-corruption movement, and in fact also reading the Italian press, the Indian press, it seems like that the big enemy of India economic growth now is the officer, is the public sector, which is too big and so on. The question is, especially to you, Mr. Reddy, as an economist, do you think that India now needs more, again, making the same question before, more liberalization, more privatization, a lower public sector? Do you think that's the good strategy or not?
Do you want to take this? Well, I think it's too simplistic a way to pose the question, though. That's how the question has been posed. And the short answer I would have is no. That's not what India needs. And we talked about the retail sector, and this again, the question of livelihoods enters there. I think India needs to have an intelligent policy, or set of policies which focus on promotion of the public good alongside economic growth or as a way to be promoted by economic growth. And economic growth as an end in itself cannot be the goal. And it is shocking. I mean, you might think it's a stereotype that I'm emphasizing that economic goal is an end in itself, but it really is for many of the people concerned. I remember in the year 2000, 1999, I attended way back, as these things go, a very high-level conference in which I was a very low-level kind of fly on the wall, and I heard let us say a couple of extremely influential people in the government of India who remain extremely influential in economic policy, reduce the problem to exactly this. And I was shocked the first time I've heard it, and since then I've heard them do it, the same people and other people do it repeatedly, because that's what they need to do to maintain foreign investor confidence, but it's also what they do, how they think about the problem. And it's a very different way from thinking about what I take to be the real problem, which has to do with the mass of livelihoods and dynamism, the dynamism that can come about through empowering people, ordinary people. So this isn't a question of handouts. You know, this is one way in which I think the social democratic measures of the current coalition government in India have been a little bit too narrow. The question is not one of simply how to create security or basic security, a social floor, although that may be important for certain purposes. I'm not against it, I'm for it. But the question is how to enable people to not only participate, but to become centers of economic dynamism. And I think the current government policy is focused on the current islands and not on that broader periphery. And this becomes increasingly a problem because of the vulnerabilities it generates. For instance, the import-intensive pattern of consumption I mentioned, whereas a pattern of consumption centered on mass domestic demand, which would be enabled by the alternative approach, would have a very different character. It would be one can hope, create a self-sustaining cycle in which that mass domestic demand in turn generates production for the domestic market, without necessarily withdrawing from the world economy at all, but having a rebalancing of this kind, which is also what China needs to do and is doing. One last word on the question of more or less, whether more or less, which is how you posed posed the problem. Just one word. There is this silly metaphor which is used in India and elsewhere by the international press talking about India, which is that if there are not more reforms, then the reform process will not only ground to a halt, but collapse. So the metaphor is that of the bicycle. In Ferrara, you will appreciate the bicycle metaphor. If you don't keep riding the bicycle, then you will collapse. Now, this has no sense to it at all. India has undertaken a certain set of reforms. Those reforms whatever one thinks of them, need not be added to, and I'm not taking a view here in this particular remark on this point, but they need not be added to, just in order to be held to. And so I think there's a poverty of the imagination in the way the question is posed. This is not directed to you, of course, but in the global media.
Bene, grazie Sanjay Reddy, Siddhartha Deb e Gyan Prakash.